It's now about 600,000.
Why did you decide to write a book called Crude Dreams?
Well, I wanted to write a book about the oil in Alaska and the politics of it. Of course, my book starts at the turn of the century and moves up to today, but statehood, Alaska's only been a state for less than 40 years. And as we got statehood in '59, the oil companies arrived about the same time, the major oil companies. So part of the story, the politics of it, is the relationship between the state, the new state, and the oil industry and how they treated each other. And it was different than most other oil places.
Why was it different?
Well, in Oklahoma, Texas, those places, they have a lot of private owners that have royalty, and so they get involved in the politics, and they have a lot to say about what goes on. Up in Alaska, I tell the story about a lot of little guys trying to get a piece of the action, and only few did. So basically in Alaska, as opposed to those other oil states, you've got basically the state government dealing directly with the oil companies, and the money that comes from the North Slope, mainly Prudhoe Bay, etc., goes directly into the state treasury. None of it, or very little of it, goes into individuals. Actually, only about 14 people got a royalty interest in oil.
Tell us about that process, the leasing, the competitive versus non-competitive process that you describe in your book. How does that work?
Well, we got to start in territorial days before statehood. It was all federal land. And the way to get a federal oil and gas lease was to go to the land office, just walk up to the counter, put down a $10 filing fee, and 25 cents an acre, and you would get a 10-year lease, federal oil and gas lease. And then if you were a little guy, you'd go and try to get an oil company to take it off your hands, assign it to them, and hope that they would drill it. And when you assigned it to them, you kept a royalty interest, and if they discovered oil on your land, you'd become wealthy. That's the way the federal system worked, and that was all non-competitive, except for a little exception around an existing oil field, and there weren't any existing oil fields in Alaska. When statehood came, we were given the right, the state was, to select 104 million acres of federal land, and we got the offshore land, so-called tide and submerged lands, out to 3 miles. Now, those lands were had to be put up competitively. So the first thing the state did was to put those lands up on a bid basis, bonus bid basis. In other words, $1 an acre or $10 or $100 an acre, and you'd get a 10-year lease from the state. And that's what happened. But little guys like me and other Alaskans could bid those too, because in those days we bid $1.05 an acre and got leases offshore. Now that's changed, of course, particularly after Prudhoe Bay, where now everything in Alaska, both federal and state, although there may be a few places that is still non-competitive for the feds, all state land is competitively bid, bonus bids, cash.
Tell us about someone named Locke Jacobs, who you describe in your book, in the plane story.
The plane?
The airplane story. Did he compete with some other folks to get his lease in and track the airplane schedule?
Oh, that story. Oh, yeah. Well, Locke it's an interesting story. It's a rags to riches. It's a Horatio Alger story. He was a guy that went up to Alaska, probably about 17 or 18, right out of high school, wanted to get involved in minerals and read a lot and worked on the railroad and ended up as a shoe clerk at the Army-Navy surplus store in Anchorage, Alaska. But he had this interest in minerals, so he researched the federal leasing laws, and he started to lease, like I say, 25 cents an acre. And he got his bosses involved, and it was that group, actually, the 14 of them, local Anchorage business people, who ended up with a royalty interest in Swanson River, which was the discovery in in 1957, a couple years before statehood. Well, on the airplane story, it was just Locke's clever way of representing an oil company trying to get ahead of their competitors, and he did a very clever thing, and I write it up. It's kind of complicated in a way, but it was just watching the oil companies as they competed and trying to decide when they were going to file. And then he had a very intricate system where he had a lady poised to file just ahead of them, and he did. And his clients got leases right in the middle of the competitors. So it was exciting times then.
How much of the oil industry did or does revolve around the little guy, the big guy, and the value of information, finding out where the filings took place? How did that work in the early days, and is it very different now?
It's quite different now. In those days, that's how I got into the oil business, reporting in a little sheet I put out called the Alaska Scouting Service. So I would report on locations of wells and depths and who was leasing and the seismic, the geophysical work that was being done. And information was very important. Scouting, every oil company had a scout or two that would go around and find out what the competitors were doing. That still goes on in the oil industry everywhere. You want to know what your competitor is doing. In Alaska now, with most of the emphasis being on the North Slope, and it being dominated basically by three companies, British Petroleum, ARCO, and Exxon, I don't sense there's an awful lot of information, but as I write up in my book, they were getting information from each other.
We wanted to ask you about the different areas of Alaska that are in your book, the North Slope and Cook Inlet. There's some pictures here. Do you want to tell us what's pictured, and are these vital areas for drilling?
Well, those three pictures are in Cook Inlet, offshore, just nearby Anchorage. And that's where the first discoveries were made. First at Swanson River on the Kenai Peninsula, which is just right off what those pictures are showing. And that was the first commercial discovery in Alaska in 1957. These are offshore rigs. There are 14 out there in Cook Inlet now. Of course, the oil industry, as I say, after statehood, when they got a hold of state leases, they went offshore, and those are permanent platforms that are producing.
Tell us more about the big oil companies, ARCO, Exxon, British Petroleum. How did their role in early Alaskan oil industry play out, and are they still big players in the state?
Well, they're still big players because they own most of the oil up on the slope. I feature British Petroleum and Richfield Oil Corporation, which was the predecessor to Atlantic Richfield, which of course is now ARCO. Starting with Richfield, it was a medium-sized major company down in Los Angeles, and they took a lot of risks. And they were the first to discover oil on the Kenai Peninsula in '57. Then they went up on the slope, and they got leases and did geophysical work, and then asked Exxon to become their partner. It was kind of odd because Richfield was very small, and Exxon, of course, is the largest of all. But they became partners in '63, and it was Richfield and Exxon that made the discovery at Prudhoe. Actually, Atlantic Refining had taken over Richfield in the meantime, so actually it was ARCO then and Exxon that made the discovery. In the case of British Petroleum, they were being excluded in certain areas in the world, as you know, in Iran in the early '50s, so they looked worldwide, as they always do, and they looked at the North Slope and looked very much like Iran topographically. And so they started leasing in '58 up there when the federal government opened some of that land to leasing. And it was on a drawing basis, and my partner and I, little guys, got involved in that because you could just put in an application. If you were drawn, you'd sell it again, you'd assign it to the oil company. So there was a lot of that going on. And BP drilled 7 wells in what we call the foothills, which is the northern slope of the Brooks Range before you get onto the plain there at on the North Slope. And they drilled 7 wells in the foothill, and they were all dry. And then Richfield, other companies did seismic work on the coastal plain, discovered some, this was in the mid-60s now, discovered some good-looking seismic anomalies, structures under the ground, and the state then put up the land, and in 64 and 65, BP got a great deal of acreage up there on the slope, and then in 65, Richfield and Exxon got their share, and it was at those two sales that basically the Prudhoe Bay field was leased, and the so-called Kuparuk, which is over on the west side. And so it's been, whatever that is, 35 years when those leases were issued, and then the discoveries were made in 67 and 68. Big.
When all this was happening, tell us about the royalty payments and the involvement of the government officials in Alaska in regulating the oil companies and negotiating royalty payments for the state. How did that work?
Well, today, the state of Alaska gets about 80% of its money from taxes and royalty, about equally. A royalty, that's 12.5%. It's 1/8 of the oil is the state's immediately. And then the question becomes, how is it valued? Who makes the determination of how much a barrel is worth? And that, of course, is a major area of dispute. The oil companies say it's worth something, and the state says. And there have been some major some lawsuits on that, and several have just been settled recently. And it's a matter of legal determination. In the early days, the state really wasn't equipped to account for the value or even the amount. The state, when it got started, just had to start from scratch. It had to build its court system, it had to build its administration, and it was, it wasn't very well equipped. And I tell the story of that and how it tried to do its job, and I spend a lot of time on the first governor, a grocer from Valdez, who was our first governor, a great man, but
what's his name?
Bill Egan, and he was very skeptical of these big guys because Alaska's history has been outside economic control of the economy. At least that's the way Alaskans saw it, and Bill Egan saw it that way. So when the industry showed up, he was pretty skeptical, and he questioned as much as he could things like the value of the royalty interest. The state didn't really have much ability to do it well.
Was he a Democrat or a Republican?
Democrat.
I wanted to ask about some of the other players in the early days that you talk about in your book. A couple names I'll just mention, and you can tell us a little bit about them. You mentioned Governor Bill Egan already. There was someone named Phil Holdsworth. Did he work for Governor Egan, and what was his role?
He was the territorial commissioner of mines, and then when the statehood came in '59, he became the first commissioner of natural resources. Phil was a hard rock miner, as were everyone else up there. There were very few people who knew anything about oil. One I feature in there is Irene Ryan, who did. She came out of Texas, and she was one of the few. Well, Phil Holdsworth was the first commissioner of natural resources, a very fine man, but it fell to him right after statehood to fashion the laws that affected the oil industry, the regulations, the lease form, and at that time Bill Egan was desperately ill and almost died the first 6 months of his term. So it fell to Phil Holdsworth to do all those things, and as I point out, he hired a lawyer from the oil industry and actually the Oil and Gas Association to draft those documents, which became very controversial, of course, in subsequent law suits where people were claiming, well, how was it that the oil industry actually drafted those things? And it was because basically the state didn't have people available to do it.
You mentioned briefly Irene Ryan. What was her involvement? How did she get to Alaska, and what was her role over the years in the oil industry?
She came up with the Federal Aviation Administration to Alaska, but she was trained as a petroleum engineer. I think she graduated in some school in Texas. Came up in the 30s, was the first woman to get her private pilot's license, and was a very active politician. She was a Democrat too, good friend of Bill Egan's. Actually, at statehood, everything was Democratic up there. It was pretty much a labor state. And Irene was in the consulting business, and then ultimately was elected to the territorial legislature, helped with the laws and regulations, and oil and gas. And then when statehood came, she was elected to the Senate. So was always active in oil legislation. She was the first one to suggest that the state have a oil severance tax, which was only 1%, but it was on the books, and it was only 1% in 1968 when Prudhoe was discovered. So I point out in my book that with 12.5% royalty and 1% severance tax, the state was going to get 13.5%, which is not very much. So during the 70s, the political battle was how to get that small amount up to what it is today, which is about 30%.
I wanted to read a passage in here where you talk about your work with somebody named Ted Stevens. We wanted to hear more about that. You write, I, a recent law school graduate, and Stevens, a seasoned political veteran and lawyer, sensed we would get along. So we opened an Anchorage law office on the second floor of the Alaska State Bank building at the corner of Fifth Avenue and East Street. In 1962, while I served as chairman of the Democratic South Central campaign, Republican Stevens ran for the U.S. Senate against Ernest, is it Gruening?
Gruening.
Gruening. Mm-hmm. Stevens and I always agreed on the need for two strong political parties in Alaska. I made certain I didn't become involved in Gruening's campaign that year, and Stevens and I didn't discuss politics in the office. Though Stevens lost, he almost single-handedly began rejuvenating the nearly moribund state Republican Party. Tell us about working with Ted Stevens.
Well, he's a good friend. A different party, probably a different way of looking at the world, but well, he's a great friend and a great public servant. Not to be too pontifical, but he's bright, very smart, hardworking, and honest. And you can't ask for much more than that in a public servant. Well, we practiced, and he was a seasoned veteran. He'd been the solicitor of the Interior Department back here before he went. Well, after Nixon was defeated, Ted came back and started and wanted to open an office, and I had just graduated from law school, so we started practicing together. And I was active in the Democratic Party. Of course, I went on and kept active there, but Alaska's a small state. Everybody knows everybody, particularly in the political roles, and it's kind of an extended family. So you fight, but you get along. But Alaska's been very lucky to have him.
A part of your book talks about the Alaskan Pipeline. Tell us, what is the Alaskan Pipeline? Was it built? When was it built? And how was Congress involved?
Well, the pipeline, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline runs from the North Slope, where there is the oil, the big oil. You know, Prudhoe is the largest oil field in North America, and the next one is right next door, Kupari. And to get it to market, they had the oil companies, BP, ARCO, and Exxon primarily, had to get it to tidewater, open water, year-round. They decided to go to Valdez, which is down on the Gulf of Alaska. You're coming down 800 miles straight down the state. And they made the discovery in '68, were ready to build a pipeline, but the problem was the federal government wouldn't issue a permit or a right-of-way permit because we, the state, the federal government, Congress, had not settled this, what we call the Alaska Native Land Claims. About 20% of our population are Native people, indigenous people who lived there forever. And they had rights. Congress had always recognized these rights, but they had never been settled. And the natives got the attention of Congress and the administration, the Kennedy administration, and they put a freeze on all land. And here the oil people had a discovery on the North Slope, wanted to get it to market, had to get a right-of-way across federal land, state land, private land, couldn't get it across federal land until Congress settled the land claims. And so there was a real battle back here, and it was finally, it was settled in December of '71. In the meantime, the Environmental Protection Act had been passed in '69, so you had a number of environmental lawsuits pending. And the court was holding up any issuance of right-of-way permits on federal land. And Congress finally waded in, and in late '73 passed the Pipeline Authorization Act and said there will be no more lawsuits. There will be a right-of-way. And the oil people finally got the right-of-way, started building the pipeline in the spring of '74, finished it in '77, and oil started flowing from the North Slope to Valdez, onto tankers, and down to the West Coast.
Who financed the construction? The oil companies, the government, state, federal?
Oh, the oil companies financed it. But again, Bill Egan came back, as I write, in early '70s and wanted the state to own the pipeline and claimed that the state could finance it, and it might have, but he couldn't get the votes in the legislature. So the oil companies financed it.
Tell us about your publisher. The name is Epicenter Press. Where are they located, and how did you find them to publish this book?
They're located in Seattle and Fairbanks, 3 owners, I believe. I approached them, told them that they should publish my book. They told me it was too large at first, too big a book for them. It's a very small regional firm that publishes Alaska books, Northwest Books, and a good firm, real fine people. I like them, but I pushed myself on them. Well.
Would you ever want to write another book, and would you work with them?
Well, I might. I'm not sure I'm going to. I might want to do it, a follow-up on this, but I don't think so. And I would do it with them, yes.
Well, Jack Roderick, thank you for coming to C-SPAN.
Thank you.